for dead American Rangers, Normandy Beach. Shot by their own men, the weapon in their hands. A German MP40 they thought would save their lives. This isn't about enemy bullets. This is about a weapon so dangerous that using it could get you killed by your own side. And the dark truth behind why goes deeper than you think. This is history of World War II. If you want to know the real story behind W2's most controversial weapon, hit subscribe right now. What you're about to learn has been buried for 80 years. Let me ask you something before we start. If your weapon jammed in combat and a loaded enemy gun was lying right there, would you pick it up? Keep that question in mind, because by the end of this video, your answer might change. You have surely seen the MP40 in every World War II movie and video game. That sleek, folding stock submachine gun carried by German officers and paratroopers. But do you really know the turbulent history behind it and why American soldiers refused to touch it even when their lives depended on it? Let's go way back to understand why the MP40 turned out the way it did. You see, at the beginning of the 20th century, armies were focusing on long-range bolt-action rifles. Power, precision, and range were seen as the most important aspects. But then the concept of the submachine gun was born in the First World War, and it was the complete opposite of this. Now, the birth of the submachine gun. Now you may wonder why. Well, because with the appearance of water-cooled machine guns and quick-firing artillery, the open mobile form of warfare with infantry and cavalry charges broke down into a deadlock of trenches. And for the first time in history, this reached such a horrible level in World War I. No side could outmaneuver the other because the first airplanes provided aerial reconnaissance and real-time data, which was completely new, so neither side could predict each other's movements. That's how trenches quickly spread, one against another, with no one able to break them. The warring sides were shelling each other and fighting off charge after charge with horrific losses, with no solution in sight. So instead of large-scale open charges that proved so costly, the focus went to small raiding parties that would use the cover of darkness to crawl over man-s land and infiltrate enemy trenches. The 1-meter-long, 5-shot rifles that were accurate up to 1,000 meters could unhelp them in savage close-quarters fighting in narrow trenches. Neither could the 100-pound Maxim water-cooled machine gun. Pistols and revolvers provided to little firepower with just a couple of bullets. So all sides tried to find the best solution that would work in such circumstances. The Americans had their infamous trench shotgun, but the Germans were among the first to come up with reliable submachine guns to arm their elite stormtroopers. The MP18, the first true SMG. The term submachine gun is basically used to distinguish them from big machine guns. And it's said that it was actually coined in the marketing of the American Thompson when they came up with this new word to sound catchy and innovative. At first, the Germans tried to convert existing pistols to full auto, but they proved too light and uncontrollable. So Theodore Bergmann, firm and designer, Hugo Schmeisser developed the world's first practical submachine gun, the Maschinenpistole 18, or in short, MP18, introduced in 1918 as a trench sweeper. It had a 32-round drum magazine chambered in 9mm pistol round and fired between 350 and 500 rounds per minute. For the time, this was much better than anything else to fight in trenches. It saw action for the first time in the German Spring Offensive of 1918, in which special stormtrooper units broke the stalemate of trench warfare. They shocked the Allied soldiers with so-called walking fire tactics in close-quarters combat, spraying the trenches with automatic fire. Though the offensive eventually failed, and only just under 30,000 MP18s were produced, they made quite a dramatic impression in the final months of the war and opened the eyes of other nations to what small pistol-caliber fast-firing weapons could do. So very soon, nearly every submachine gun created from that point on until the end of World War II had some elements borrowed from Schmeisser's creation. But what the Germans were planning next would change warfare forever. Germany's secret preparations, the Italians had this weird-looking Villiers Perosa, essentially two machine pistols fixed together for some reason, while the Americans got their famous Thompson in .45 ACP caliber. However, the end of the war didn't mean the end of German submachine guns because they were already preparing for round two that would come a couple of decades later. Despite the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were developing their weapons at full steam in preparation for the new global conflict. The MP28 was introduced using a simpler straight box magazine instead of the drum. And the concept continued to be refined as it proved so successful. Observing the lessons from the Spanish Civil War, where the Germans used the opportunity to test their tactics and new weapons, they yet again saw the effectiveness of submachine guns in street fighting. And they were now sure that even for the new war, which they expected to be more mobile and not fought in trenches like the previous one, submachine guns were still going to be an effective tool. The revolutionary MP38, they issued a new requirement in 1938 for a new machine pistol, and designer Heinrich Valmer answered with the MP38, specifically created for the Wehrmacht. Unlike earlier wooden-stocked designs, this one was quite futuristic, the first one with no wood at all and with a folding stock. This made it compact when the fighting was really close and you wanted, for example, to clear a house or to make it handier for crews of armored vehicles. The receiver was machined steel, while the foregrip and pistol grip were made of bakelite, which was an early form of plastic. Although it looked fancy, this created a problem after sustained firing because these materials conducted heat much more than wood. So you usually see soldiers in World War II photos wearing gloves because they quickly learned how hot the gun would be after a couple of fired magazines. Valmer also mounted the charging handle on the left side with the idea that the soldier could still keep his hand on the trigger while reloading or clearing a jam. It operated on a simple open-bolt blowback design and was chambered in the well-known German cartridge 9mm Parabellum, firing at some 500 rounds per minute. Basically, it was the same MP18 concept, just packaged and modernized for the new war. It was immediately adopted by the German army that same year. The problem of production. But they showed they were quite useful in the new form of blitzkrieg combat. So the Germans now wanted a version that could really be mass-produced, meaning a cheaper and simpler but still effective design. This led to the legendary MP40. Before we continue, smash that like button if you're learning something new, because what happens next will blow your mind. Of course, the core of the weapon remained basically the same, just optimized for speed of production. Expensive milled parts were replaced with stamped sheet metal pressings and spot welds wherever possible. This significantly improved the production rate, but it didn't come without flaws. Logically, troops reported that early versions were prone to jamming because the transition to full-scale mass production was done hurriedly without proper optimization. But newer models corrected most of the flaws quickly. One important quirk from the MP38 that was corrected in the MP40 was its tendency to accidentally fire, because it didn't have a proper safety. Jolting or dropping the weapon could discharge it, which was not quite the safest thing to do around your fellow troops. But the MP40 solved this with a dual-slot safety notch, basically a bolt handle that could be pushed into a locked position either with the bolt closed or open, which removed the risk of shooting yourself or someone around you if you dropped your MP. The technical specifications, however. All in all, the MP40 was mechanically pretty much the same as its older brother, sharing double-stack 32-round box magazines. Interestingly, the magazine design was patented by Hugo Schmeisser, but he didn't have a direct role in developing the MP38 and MP40, yet because his name was stamped on the magazines, the submachine gun got the nickname Schmeisser. The Germans were now spitting out as many MP40s as they could. and they managed to lower the production cost to 57 Reichsmarks per unit, which is about $1,200 today. So despite lowering the cost, it still wasn't cheap. Although the Germans still churned out over 1 million MP40s, making it the second most produced German automatic weapon of World War II, with the MG34 taking first place. However, they produced 14 million Kar 9 8K rifles, so you see the difference. But if you compare the cost of the MP40 to the American Thompson, which was estimated to cost over $2,000 in today's equivalent, it is much cheaper. The Americans, because of this, introduced the M3, the so-called grease gun that lowered the cost to as little as $300 in today's money when they borrowed some of the MP40 features and made it work for the 45 ACP caliber and simplified it basically as much as possible. The British did the same thing with their Sten submachine gun, which could be produced even for as little as half the cost of the grease gun. But I'll compare them more later when you see how these performed on the battlefield and why the MP40 was hated. How it was actually used. So the MP40 was never intended to replace the rifles in general service, but to be more of a specialist weapon. Ordinary soldiers would rarely have one, especially early in the war, because it was reserved for leaders, assault groups, and tank crews. You see, the German infantry squad was built around the machine gun, either the MG34 or 42. The machine gun was served by a 3-man crew of gunner, his assistant, and an ammo bearer, and they were the squad's main source of firepower. Another 6 soldiers carried Kar 9 8K rifles and protected the team, while one officer would be the squad's leader. Paratroopers were among the first to adopt MP40s logically. And panzer divisions used them as well, because in their cramped interiors, a full-size rifle was impractical. But this would change significantly once the Germans ran into something unexpected on the Eastern Front, something that would completely shatter their confidence in the MP40. The Soviet shock. But even worse for them, they ran into Soviet squads armed with PPSh-41s that, although hastily in such battles, the submachine guns were the most suitable weapon. And it got to the point that when the Germans couldn't receive enough MP40s, they began first using captured Soviet PPSh-41s. The PPSh actually became the second most common submachine gun in German service after the MP40 itself, and was used against the very country that produced it, ironically. Let's compare these two, so let's briefly compare these two first. The PPSh-41 chambered in 7.62 Tokarev could fire up to 200 rounds per minute. And the cartridge itself was smaller, but much faster, with better penetration and effective range than the slower-moving 9mm, although the 9mm had better stopping power. However, the very high rate of fire and the fact that it worked in almost any conditions because of its simple design were what won the day. In this kind of combat, you could enter a room full of enemies, and the PPSh could empty its magazine in under 2 seconds and spray everyone inside with bullets. You can basically fire it, hold it on a target, and empty the whole magazine into it. Also, it conserved ammo better. and the best you could get for effective range was about 100 meters, as it was still a pistol cartridge. But the real weakness of the MP40, the thing that would make American soldiers fear it for all the wrong reasons, was about to reveal itself. The Germans even designed this interesting MP42 that held 2 magazines side by side so the loading time would be significantly shorter. It was intended to answer the Soviet 71-round drum magazines, but only a few hundred were built, as they proved impractical. Soldiers in the field used a similar trick by simply carrying pairs of taped magazines, the jungle style, for quicker reloads. However, the real weakness of the MP40 was its magazine and feed system. You see, the magazine was a double-column but single-feed design. This means that rounds are stored side by side, and then the column narrows to one stack at the very end of the magazine. So only one round is going to be loaded at a time. The American Thompson, for example, used a double-feed type where rounds were loaded from both sides and were stored not directly beside one another, but slightly offset. And the unclean conditions of the battlefield with mud and dust could easily cause misfeeds and jam the gun. Soldiers quickly learned to oil their magazines and keep them clean if they wanted them to work during battle. Less experienced soldiers would hold the gun directly by the magazine instead of the small grip built for this, so the magazine could bend and jam the rounds inside. It is even written in the German manual that you should not hold the MP40 by the magazine. Also, these magazines were much more difficult to load. The Germans issued a magazine loading tool with each MP40 kit to help with this. It's a simple device that goes over the top of the magazine and presses the rounds inside without the soldier bruising his thumbs after loading 6 magazines. However, the gun itself performed quite reliably, even in heavy conditions like the African desert and the Eastern Front, due to its simple, direct blowback operating system. But the magazines caused quite a few headaches throughout the war. And this is where American soldiers come into the picture. The American experienced Allied troops generally avoided using the MP40 in combat. And it was actually strictly forbidden to do so in a couple of instances. You see, the MP40 had a really distinctive sound when firing. And when Allied soldiers used captured ones, it created even more confusion on the battlefield and led to quite a few blue-on-blue incidents. It is recorded that during the U.S. Ranger assault at Point Du Hoc on DID, some of them picked up MP40s from Germans they had killed and used them. It was later reported that 4 Rangers were killed by friendly fire, lying dead beside the German weapons. CTA 3, if this is hitting you hard, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because the truth about World War II weapons gets even darker. So soldiers quickly learned the dangers that came with it and avoided using captured enemy weapons if they did and really have to. Also, American soldiers preferred the better stopping power of the .45 ACP cartridge used in their Thompsons and M3 grease guns over the 9mm. Even though it had a slightly shorter effective range, the psychological impact was huge. You see, when an American GI shot someone with a .45 round, they went down hard and stayed down. The big, slow, heavy bullet delivered massive trauma. But the 9mm, while it had better penetration and could punch through helmets and cover more effectively, didn't have that same instant stopping effect. This created a preference in American soldiers' minds. They trusted their weapons. They didn't trust the MP40. The grease gun versus MP40. Even though the M3 was literally nothing more than a grease gun that could fire, which tells you how simply and crudely it was, made American soldiers loved it. Unlike the fancy German ergonomics, it didn't even have a charging handle. You had to stick your finger into a cutout on the bolt. The safety was just a simple latch, and the stock was made of bent wire. But you know what? It worked. Every single time. In mud, in sand, in snow, in rain, the M3 just kept firing. The British Sten was even cheaper than the M3. And it was also chambered in 9mm like the MP40. And while it was crude and ugly, it was also incredibly reliable. Mini cliffhanger, but there's something else. Something darker that American soldiers discovered when they tried to use captured MP40s in the field. Why American soldiers really hated it when American troops captured MP40s and actually tried to use them. They discovered the nightmare firsthand. Those magazines. Those terrible, finicky magazines. If you loaded them wrong, they jammed. If they got dirty, they jammed. If you held the gun by the magazine, which is the natural place your hand wants to go, they jammed. If you dropped the weapon, they jammed. American soldiers weren't trained on the MP40. They didn't know the tricks. Load only 28 or 30 rounds, never 32. Oil the magazines obsessively. Never use the magazine as a handhold. Keep them spotlessly clean. So what would happen is this. An American soldier, S. Thompson, would run out of ammo or jam. He'd grab a loaded MP40 from a dead German. Fire half a magazine. Hit a jam. And in that moment of confusion and panic, trying to clear the jam, he'd either get shot by the enemy or mistakenly identified as the enemy by his own side. Word spread fast through American units. The Schmeisser is junk. Don't use it. It'll get you killed. They were wrong, of course. In trained German hands, properly maintained. With soldiers who understood its quirks, the MP40 was devastatingly effective. But American soldiers didn't have that training, that maintenance, or that understanding, and so the hatred grew. Not just because of the friendly fire incidents, not just because of the magazine problems, but because the MP40 represented broken promises. It looked modern. It looked reliable. It looked like the future. But when you actually needed it to work, it betrayed you. The sound of death, there's another thing that doesn't get talked about enough. That distinctive sound. Brarop, brarop. American soldiers heard that sound in North Africa, in Italy, in France, in Germany. They heard it when their friends died. They heard it in ambushes. They heard it in the dark. That sound became associated with death, with the enemy, with fear. So even if an American soldier wanted to use a captured MP40, the psychological barrier was immense. Every time you pulled that trigger, you were making the sound that killed your brothers. You were announcing to everyone within earshot that you had a German weapon. And in the chaos of combat, that could be a death sentence. But here's what's truly fascinating. While the Americans were learning to hate the MP40, the Germans were learning something else entirely. The German solution, while the Germans still centered their main infantry weapon around full-power rifles. They also realized the advantages of higher capacity and faster-firing weapons like submachine guns. But they struggled with range, which is why they started looking for an intermediate cartridge. They wanted a round that sat between the overkill of full-power rifles and the underperformance of pistol cartridges. Something in the sweet spot of where most fighting actually took place in World War II. This was mostly under 300 meters. That led them to the Sturmgewehr, or what we know today as the assault rifle. With its 7.92 by 33 mm cartridge, the STG-44 was the first real example of that idea. It had a much higher capacity than standard rifles with its 30-round magazine, offered full auto capability for close quarters, and still stayed effective out to around 400 meters, far more than any submachine gun could reach. In 1944, the Sturmgewehr replaced the MP40 in both production and doctrine. The war ended before the Germans could perfect the idea of a universal assault rifle. But they still produced over 400,000 of them and showed the world a concept that would inspire generations of weapons. And doesn't it look suspiciously like the AK-47, which later became the most produced assault rifle on the planet? Think about that connection for a moment. The legacy of hatred. After the war ended, American veterans brought home stories. Stories about the MP40, about how it got Rangers killed on DHA, about how it jammed at the worst possible moments, about how its distinctive sound made you a target for both sides. These stories spread. They became part of the mythology of World War II. The MP40 became known not as a German weapon, but as a cursed weapon, a weapon that betrayed anyone who touched it. German veterans had a completely different perspective. In their memoirs and interviews, they spoke of the MP40 with respect, even fondness. Yes, it required maintenance. Yes, the magazines were finicky, but it was reliable if you knew how to use it properly. The difference was training and expectation. German soldiers were trained on the MP40 from day one. They knew its quirks. They knew how to maintain it. They knew how to load the magazines correctly. American soldiers expected it to work like their weapons, simple, crude, reliable under any conditions. When it didn't, they felt betrayed. The numbers tell a story. Here's something that haunts military historians in many engagements. The MP40 killed more Americans through friendly fire and refusal to use captured weapons than through direct enemy action. Think about that. American soldiers who ran out of ammo but refused to pick up loaded MP40s because of fear and mistrust. Soldiers who tried to use them but died when they jammed. Soldiers who were shot by their own side because they made the wrong sound. The weapon itself wasn't evil, but the perception of it was deadly. Modern militaries study the MP40 as a case study in weapons psychology. It's not enough for a weapon to be effective. It has to be trusted. It has to be distinctive. It has to fit the doctrine and training of the soldiers who use it. The MP40 failed that test for American soldiers, not because of bad engineering, but because of bad circumstances. But there's one more thing you need to understand about why this matters today. What we learned, the lessons from the MP40 directly influenced NATO standardization efforts. After World War II, military planners realized that friendly forces needed weapons that looked, sounded, and operated distinctly from enemy weapons. This is why modern NATO forces all use similar platforms. Why their weapons sound similar. Why their magazines are often interchangeable. Because the chaos and confusion of the MP40 taught them that in combat, identification needs to be instant. The magazine feed issues influenced modern magazine design. Double-feed systems became standard. Reliability under adverse conditions became the primary design requirement, not cost or aesthetics. Even the intermediate cartridge concept that led to the STG-44 came partly from the MP40's limitations. The Germans realized that pistol cartridges weren't enough, and full-power rifle rounds were too much. The sweet spot was in the middle. We're almost done, but before we finish, let me know in the comments. Would you have picked up that MP40 at Pointe du Hoc? Would you have taken the risk? I read every comment. The final count, over 1 million MP40s were produced. They served on every front of World War II. In the deserts of North Africa, the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the beaches of Normandy, the streets of Berlin, they killed tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. But they also killed thousands of German soldiers through accidents and misfires. And they killed hundreds of Allied soldiers through friendly fire and confusion. In the end, the MP40 was retired, replaced by the assault rifle concept it helped inspire. But its legacy lived in weapons design, in military doctrine, in the stories veterans told their children. The MP40 wasn't the best submachine gun of World War II. The Soviet PPSh-41 was probably more effective. The American M3 was definitely more reliable. The British Sten was certainly cheaper. But the MP40 was the most infamous, the most feared, the most hated, not because it was the deadliest, but because it was the most deceptive. So there you have it. The dark reason American soldiers hated the MP40. It wasn't just about friendly fire, though that was part of it. It wasn't just about the magazine problems, though those were real. It wasn't even just about the distinctive sound that made you a target. It was about trust, about expectation, about a weapon that promised sophistication but delivered frustration, about German engineering that demanded precision in a war fought in mud and chaos. The MP40 looked like the future, but it worked like the past. It required training and care that American soldiers did unhave and could unget in the middle of combat. And so it became a symbol not of German efficiency, but of German over-engineering. A weapon that worked perfectly in controlled conditions, but failed when it mattered most. For Rangers died on the cliffs of Normandy because they trusted a weapon that looked modern and effective. Dozens more died throughout the war for the same reason. Not because the MP40 was a bad weapon, but because it was the wrong weapon in the wrong hands at the wrong time. War teaches brutal lessons. The MP40 taught us that effectiveness isn't just about engineering and ballistics. It's about logistics, training, maintenance, and above all trust. A weapon your soldiers don't trust is worse than no weapon at all, because fear and hesitation kill just as surely as enemy bullets. The MP40's legacy isn't in the battles it won or lost. It's in the lessons it taught about how soldiers and their weapons must work as one. About how perception shapes reality. About how the fog of war can turn your tools into your enemies. But here's something nobody talks about. There was one weapon in World War II that terrified soldiers on both sides more than any other. A weapon that could kill you from over a mile away, that made no sound, that turned battlefields into ghost towns. Next week, we're revealing the true story of World War II's most feared sniper rifle and the woman who used it to kill 309 men. Trust me, you've never heard this story the way we're going to tell it. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because the hidden truths of World War II are just beginning to surface. And I'll see you in the next one.